All right, so I think we're going to get going here. Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm Shannon Bryans, longtime lecturer here at SNRA in 1998, and since 1998, and what that means is I was here long enough to meet Shaw when he was a student here. So anyone who was around here, I guess 15 to 20 years ago, may have met Shaw as a eager master's student first. Finishing in, I think actually it says on your slide maybe, '06. And then he, like many, he decided to stick around and do a PhD here under the tutelage of Mike Wiley for the chair of his committee. That finished up, I think, in 2013. But what I remember fondly about Shaw's time here is that he was a friend to all. He was definitely sort of a archetype SNRE at the time, so SNERD is what we used to say, student. But he could talk to policy students, he could talk to landscape architecture students, he could talk to ESM, GDS, or whatever we were calling the tracks back then. He could talk to them all. And not only that, but I mean, he was sort of a great emissary for the school. A real sort of showcase of sort of sustainability ideas and discussion and engagement in action. Everything from biking from Saginaw Forest. Shaw was one of the very last caretakers who lived at Saginaw Forest. And so everything from sort of biking in there every day.
In the winter, too.
Even in the winter, and even after a car tried to damage his bike. Long on dedication, great for conversation, and a friend to all. So we're really fortunate to have sort of Shaw kind of back in the fold a little bit. He pitched a bunch of master project ideas for this current cohort, one of which was chosen. So I see a few of those students here. And so I think he took the opportunity to come visit with that group, but also was just hopeful to kind of engage with anyone who's interested in chit-chatting. He's going to tell us about some of what he's been up to, sort of since living here, since he was here last. And I think with the hopes of potential future collaborations in store for anyone at U of M who basically would be curious in matching up with some boots on the ground down in Chile, really close to Patagonia. All right, with that, I'm sure he's going to give us more of his own introduction, but I'll turn it over. And just one note, this is being recorded, and so if you know someone who will be interested in this talk later on, they basically should get in touch with Shaw, and he'll have a copy of this presentation.
All right. Thank you, Shannon. It's a great pleasure to come back and see all the things that have changed, all the things that have remained the same, to see old faces, new faces, and also to be able to share some of the things that I've been doing that had been born here at University of Michigan in the School of Natural Resources and in the Institute for Fisheries Research. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about work in Chile. So a thing to note about Chile is that it is really different than Michigan. So one of the things that really makes a difference is that it's got mountains, like some of the highest mountains in the Americas kinds of mountains. And it is one of the narrowest, longest countries in the world. And what we're talking about when we're talking narrow is that from the mountain to the sea is going to be less than 100 miles. That's about how wide the country is for most of where people live. But what that also means is that we're moving from tropical latitudes in the north all the way to sub-Antarctic climates in the south. We're going from like 20-odd degrees to 56 degrees of latitude. So we have a lot of different kinds of precipitation and climatic effects that are happening across this range, and it's interacting with that landscape to create a variety of river types. The majority of these rivers would be classified as small watersheds at a global scale. So if we're comparing them to watersheds in Michigan, these are going to be larger than the Huron, but not as, maybe about the same size as like, what was the one up here? The Tittabawassee Saginaw watershed. That's about the size of the medium, larger Chilean rivers. They're also, most of them tend to be, because they're coming off the mountains, they tend to be very torrential rivers. Okay, so we're dealing a lot of river power, but also they don't have a lot of consistency in flow. Except in the very south, where again things are different. Okay, but the focus of today is not so much on Patagonia, but on this diversity. In addition to that, the place which has the most rivers and small streams is the place where you have the most amount of land use, human history of land use in agriculture, irrigation, more recently industrial and urban uses. And so because this is the center of politics, society, planning, governance is right in this area, the focus, and this is a Mediterranean climate that we're talking about. So hot, dry summers, wet, cold winters. This is the planning framework that is imposed on the rest of the country. So we are governed by a reality of Mediterranean rivers in central Chile, even though the rivers of the rest of Chile function very differently. Because centralization, okay. But what this also means is that the focus on all the institutions until the last 10 years has been around water scarcity, water as a natural resource, and not thinking about water as a component of ecosystems, let alone of ecology within those ecosystems. That's one of the things to framework. But talking about those, what we're looking at the fish, this is also really different than Michigan. So here, high quality rivers, we will call those trout streams. We want to be conserving those for purposes of biodiversity, using trout as indicator species, and which also have a large social component, economic component. In southern Chile, trout are invasive species because they do not exist natively on the landscape. What we have are the native species are either from a Gondwanan distribution, such as the Galaxiidae, which there are 9 species out of the 43 that are native to all of Chile, very low diversity, or they evolved in the Americas. Okay, so put that up there. So in these cases, what we have is we have conditions where we have very low diversity. The rivers are very small, but that also means that the fish tend to be quite small. The largest of the native fish gets to be about 1 foot in length as an adult, and as such, these are also prime target species for the trout that have been placed in these rivers. So what that also means is that out of the 43 species, I think 39 of them are considered endangered to some level, primarily from trout. So we also have, in addition to 10 species of salmonids, we have an additional 18 species of other types of non-native. Most of those were for production purposes. They were introduced, but also we have, Chile was at the forefront of 1920s public health, and so they introduced mosquito control vectors, mosquito control fish, gambusia, which have overridden a lot of the rivers in the more warm water areas of Chile, and so are overwhelming the ecological niches. So we have also introduced species that are creating displacement, homogenization of communities, as well as localized extinctions. Now, another thing which is very different with Michigan is if we're looking at trying to do any kind of ecological work with freshwater fish, we like to have data. And in Michigan, we have tens of thousands of, or hundreds of thousands of data points gathered over the course of nearly a century. In Chile, no. There are maybe tens of thousands of points of data across the entire country that have been begrudgingly given because the Ministry of Environment says, hey, you used public money for that, so we need that data. And a lot of people were like, wait, we lost our data. We can't find it. And so what should be also many, many points of data are very few. The other thing is the work tends to be in where the location where most people live, which is central Chile. And the majority of work falls into natural history, research, taxonomical research, physiological research, site-to-site comparisons of, hey, we're going to look at 5 sites on this river. How are they operating? Looking at implications of invasive species, or the vast majority of them are, we went to the river to look at what was there prior to building a dam. Okay, so we have limited types of data when we're trying to look at developing understandings of species range and looking at these from a larger framework of fish evaluations. And this all comes into the context of, in the mid-2010s, a desire from the central government to incorporate in a more holistic way freshwater environmental components to development plans. So what we need is we need to have models. Suddenly, in about 2015, the government was looking for models that would be landscape scale to do assessments of freshwater ecosystems and their ecology that can respond to expected landscape change due to for the development policies, and connect with specific needs for water projects, aquaculture projects, and large-scale land use, land cover change. In Michigan, we had a lot of things that were connected to landscape scale pieces. In Chile, there was nothing. Not only that, there were no freshwater ecologists that worked at that scale. But me, I was there. I happened to be there. And I was also in Michigan here working using the VSEC framework, which was co-developed by Paul Seelbach. And one of the things that it does is that it classifies ecologically distinct river valley segments based on hydrology, temperature, geology, and landform. And this is currently the framework that's used as a governance management for water withdrawals in the state of Michigan. So my idea was, let's see how much we can cobble together from the background of this framework into the Chilean context. So here were the challenges. Chile had no typology for rivers that were based around ecologically significant parameters. It was all geomorphological. It's like, okay, we can work with that. We had, which I discussed earlier, very limited fish occurrence data. There were many rivers which had almost no data. Habitat suitability information was nearly completely absent in a quantitative form. It was all basically natural history descriptions. And the GIS vector data from the government agency in charge of freshwater systems was based around hydrological concerns and not ecological concerns. So these were some of the major challenges that confronted the initial process. We had parameterization goals of determining ecologically relevant river valley segments, evaluating habitat suitability for freshwater fishes using physical parameters and all the available fish occurrence data that we could get our hands on, and also then developing fish responses to different physical parameters in order to address implications for ecosystem change. So we had to match those goals with those challenges. And so in 2015, I was tapped. I was finishing a postdoc, and I got a knock on the door, and it was the person who was the lead researcher in Chile for hydrology and the lead author for the IPCC reports for Chile relating to water. And he's like, I hear that you work with fish. I was like, yeah? It's like, do you know about landscapes and how it's connected with fish? I'm like, I'm just finishing my postdoc on that. Yes. And he said, okay, you're working on my project. And I'm like, okay, I will do that. So the idea here was the Ministry of Energy had taken a bunch of lessons in the prior decade of having very poor environmental planning in rivers to say we need to do sustainable hydro that incorporates river ecology. And so I was brought in to help with that. This was part of a multidimensional project that was put toward the goal of how to incorporate as much hydropower into central southern Chile as possible while minimizing ecological risks on terrestrial ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, and then also minimizing risks and cultural risks to indigenous groups and also to local communities. My function was to work in a small team with this hydrologist, a geomorphologist, and a couple others, plus their graduate students, to determine the ecology part of that. And so we developed what I mentally call VSEC version 1. And this was focused on 3 major river basins in central Chile, the Maule, the Biobío, and the Tolten. And it incorporated hydrology, fluvial geomorphology, and freshwater ecology. Briefly, what we wanted to do, so here are the major rivers, and these are the locations, the points are the locations where we got our fish occurrence data. Okay, so very limited data. We were able to go to the field and collect a little bit more, but not that much. So we had tramos con datos de especies, so we had some river reaches where we have data on fish. We make connections between physical parameters and modifications to that might come in due to landscape or climatic change. We have the fish that were there, so these are different types of endangerment, if they're endemic or exotic. And so we're looking at fish. We're doing statistical analysis. In this case, it was, because we had a very limited time to do this, we were only looking at general linear models to try and coordinate with ecological proxies for discharge, for slope, for temperature, in order to connect with presence, absence, likelihoods of fish. And then once we create that ecological model, we then feed it back to the rest of the river system in order to say, is it likelier than not that species X is going to be in that section of river? Okay. One of the other things that we had to do was we had to break up all of these river basins into things that appeared roughly ecologically consistent within each segment. So one of the things that's not necessarily clear in these images is that because of the geomorphology of these rivers in central Chile, there are some very long sections where things are quite consistent across these long stretches, especially in the valleys. And then they become the river networks become very complex as we approach the Andes or when we go through the coastal range. And so those factors have to be incorporated in a way that doesn't match how the hydrologists are looking at it, but are looking at it from a topological, ecological perspective. That was a whole other sub-project that I'm mentioning, but I don't want to get into too much detail. It allowed us, though, this process allowed us to evaluate for the likely presence of fish in all of the river segments of these three rivers. and we developed models for specifically for endangered species, for endemic species, and for developing what we called non-intervened fluvial communities. So basically, communities that had at least a certain richness of pseudo-richness of presence of species. And this allowed us to say, okay, this was a proof of concept that worked, because we were also able to re-predict the places where we had data with like a 95% accuracy. So we're like, okay, that's pretty good. We took this method, and then I gave a week-long workshop to professors at universities that were working on that were tasked at working with other watersheds, who were basically people that studied point by point, site by site ecologies, how to take their data and apply it to landscapes. Because they all knew that it was possible, but they didn't work that way. And so I had to teach a whole bunch of professors how to do that. So thank you, Paul. And then in 2023, I got another knock. I was no longer working at the Catholic University where I did my postdoc, but I got an email that said, so you know that Chile just passed a climate change adaptation policy that requires doing what you did for the Ministry of Energy, but for all the rivers in Chile, and looking at climate change instead of hydropower. And I said, that's cool. And he said, do you want to do this? I said, oh, yeah, I do. So, really briefly,
celebramos la promulgación de la Ley Marco de Cambio Climático, una ley que tiene como objetivo que Chile va a ser carbono neutral y resiliente al clima a más tardar al año 2050. Esto significa que fija un norte por los próximos 30 años, que va a cambiar de manera muy estructural la manera que funciona el Estado para lograr los objetivos de descarbonizarnos y construir una sociedad resiliente.
Oops, sorry. Basically, I was going to use that as an opportunity to take a drink. But the climate change framework law has three different components working at a national level, administrative regional level. There are 16 administrative regions in Chile that are kind of broadly analogous to states, and then at a county/city level. At each of these levels, there are different sectors that need to develop adaptation plans, and these then have to interact with each other in this kind of very complicated technical governance structure that someone with a PhD on governance probably developed. So at the national level, there was part of the Ministry of Environment, which is in charge of organizing this whole thing. There was a section which was on biodiversity. And most of the work in Chile relating with climate change historically has been on terrestrial biodiversity because of the lack of people studying freshwater ecology. The guy that was in charge of that also wanted to do it for freshwater ecology. And so the challenge here is to meet some of the goals of developing a climate action plan that can help develop a climate action plan that goes for climate neutrality, carbon neutrality by 2050 in Chile. And to look at biodiversity conservation under climate change, specifically for biodiversity. So in this context, we're looking at rising air and water temperatures that, in the context for rivers, leads to increased thermal stress, reduced dissolved oxygen, increased evapotranspiration. In the very far south and throughout the mountain ranges as well, we have increased temporarily increased discharge because of melting glaciers. But then we're having this long-term decline because once the glaciers are kind of retreated to a certain point, the amount of water that's available suddenly declines. We also are looking at potentials for altered hydrologies with more intense rainfall and all of those pieces that will be affecting the rivers. The challenge for VSEC version 2 is that we need to model all the river systems in Chile. We need to develop habitat suitability models that respond to the factors that are modeled by climate change models, specifically precipitation and temperature, and then ideally also land use, using as a baseline the historical conditions and putting as the future conditions 2050 and 2070. And then this one is that we had to create it using a raster database using the 30 arcsecond resolution. So all of those things. And again, we still have a limited occurrence, species occurrence data, but much better than what we had in 2015. Because since 2015, the Ministry of Environment kept pressing for more data. So in this case, we were working with about 100,000 data points across Chile. However, one of the big problems is we didn't have a modeling system for hydrology, let alone temperature of water. There were also many smaller rivers or less important rivers that had no hydrological model associated. Now, the nice thing is that there was a paper and a study that was done years prior where they were modeling likely land use change scenarios in the future with climate change. So we said, great, yoink, we don't need to worry about that. So we had to figure out ways to develop proxies for the most important ecological variables, water temperature, and discharge. And these parameters had to be sensitive to climatic change, right? So what we developed for discharge was we used a precipitation-weighted area discharge relationship, right? So area discharge relationship, as you grow your watershed in area, your discharge will increase. Your average discharge value is therefore modeled relatively conservatively and consistently. The one problem is it only works within one basin and not between basins because precipitation is different between basins. So what we did was we developed using ArcGIS, we developed a way of incorporating not just slope and area, but also precipitation as a weight when we were developing the flow accumulation models. So all of our flow accumulation models incorporated precipitation, upstream precipitation, as a factor in the model. Not the best solution, but far better than anything that was available. And because for most of Chile, groundwater is not a significant component, we could justify using precipitation as a primary driver for river discharge. For water temperature, we also had no model. And if you have ever tried to model water temperature, it is really hard. But again, for most of Chile, we don't have groundwater, which moderates water temperature. So what we looked at was where we had enough water temperature measurements, and we were looking at the correlation between air temperature and water temperature, and it was highly correlated. So we said, okay, it doesn't matter. We don't really care what the number is. We care what the pattern is. And if the pattern is correlated with water temperature, it's good enough for what we need. So we utilized a suite of air temperature measurements, air temperature models, raster models, and used that as our proxy for water temperature. And for land use change, we just used the study that was done previously, Benitez Silva et al., 2021. For the fish distributions, we had to make sure that it was going to give us information that would be altered based on climate. So we developed this very simple process where we have the species occurrence data, we have historical conditions we have our proxy for discharge, our proxy for temperature, and our land use land cover, and we use them. This time we had a little bit more time. We used general linear modeling, random forest modeling, and Maxent. And we had 25 iterations for each of these models using different input randomizers for our 48 species that we modeled. And then we evaluated each one of those models based on we split it into training data and testing data. We evaluated based on the testing data, the testing data, chose the best one, and then fed those back into the historical conditions to develop our historical habitat suitability, to show the maps of where we expect them to be, each of the fish. And then we use that same suite of ecological niche models for future conditions of 2050 for precipitation, which was our proxy for discharge, air temperature, which is our proxy for water temperature, and the land use from the model to develop a 2050 habitat suitability and a 2070 habitat suitability for those species. So, hey, it worked. Okay. I was worried that it would wash out too much. But we have here, red is low pseudo species richness, blue is high. So this is the pseudo richness at a 30 arc second scale. 30 arc seconds is roughly 1 square kilometer. So roughly 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. But this is looking at how we incorporate more and more species, native species, as we go downstream. And so all of the models that we developed, we evaluated and made sure that they had a true skill statistic, right, to evaluate the ability to predict the data of over 90%. And most of them were over 95%. So we said, okay, this is good for the baselines. And then we fed it into the climate change for native species and then later for exotic species. And one of the things that we did to try to minimize some of the error at the local level was to put it at biogeographical contexts. So we have in the Altiplano, which is the high area shared with the Lake Titicaca ecosystems, we see a minor decrease and a slight increase in the area of native fishes. In the Atacama, which is the dry desert of northern Chile, up here, we have a decrease in both time periods. In the Mediterranean zone, where most of Chile lives, most of the people live, and also where we have the highest biodiversity, it is a consistent decrease of about 3%. In the Valdivian Lakes region, which is this section here, over 50% declines. And in Patagonia, we have a little bit of negative and positive. But the main expected change is in the Valdivian Lakes region because of a significant decrease in expected precipitation. We ran these for the natives and then the exotics. So the Altiplano says that there is an 8,000%. The problem with that is we have very low amounts of data, so it overshot the model prediction is ridiculous, but we do expect a significant change in the expansion of exotic species. In the Atacama, we expect that there could be a decrease and then an increase because the shifting of the ecological envelope is going to be significant over the time to create more environmental niche space for invasive species. The Mediterranean zone has a general increase in the types of invasive species, as well as 11 to 26% in the Valdivian Lakes, and then massive increases in Patagonia as the water temperatures increase beyond absolute frigidity to things that trout will actually be able to expand in. So one of the problems with, if you want to study trout in Patagonia, it's really difficult because it's too cold for trout. So that in the futures, we're expecting it to be warm enough to be actually quite optimal for trout. So in this case, we did an evaluation for 34 native species, 15 exotic species at a very fine geographic scale, again, showing the ability of the VSEC framework to develop species distributions in the historical context, recapitulate those appropriately from the observed data, and then use that to evaluate what we expect to happen in a climate change future. So all of this is important because, as I learned here at the school, right, effective policy design needs to have landscape scale. Well, effective, environmental policy needs to have effective landscape scale ecological data across national scales. The other thing is, just because you lack data, just because you don't have the modeling frameworks, doesn't mean that you cannot or should not take action. So, starting something is better than starting something and working in a way that makes contextual sense, on solid evidence, and is able to recapitulate what you need to, even though it might be conservative, is better than doing nothing. Knowing your modeling assumptions, such as the ones that were behind both version 1 and 2, can help with improving models in a constructive way in the future. Data gaps, model gaps, policy gaps, oh my. So just because you don't have data does not mean you cannot build meaningful models. And then, like I said before, helping to develop the future means that you have to know what the assumptions were when you built the model to begin with. And I like this phrase. I like that saying, all models are wrong, some are useful. And so science can incrementally improve the models of the world. However, you cannot improve a non-existent model.